The town of Redemption Flats was dying of thirst. It had not seen a meaningful drop of rain in 2 years, and the sky, a vast and unforgiving expanse of pale blue, offered no promise of relief. Dust, the color of rust and bone, was the settlement's new topsoil. It settled in a fine powder on every windowsill, coated the tongues of men and beasts, and rose in ghostly plumes with every weary footstep. The sun was a merciless tyrant, beating down on the cracked earth until it resembled the skin of an old man, fissured and gray. Hope had dried up with the wells, leaving only a brittle residue of quiet desperation. In the center of this desolation, where the general store and the saloon faced each other across a street of pulverized dirt, a small crowd had gathered. They were drawn not by a spectacle of joy, but by the familiar theater of misery. Jebediah Miller, a farmer whose land had turned to powder, stood before the wagon of a traveling merchant. Jebediah was a scarecrow of a man, his overalls hanging loose on a frame that had shed its muscle and fat weeks ago. His face was a mask of despair, his eyes sunk deep into their sockets. "Please, Phineas," he rasped, his voice as dry as the wind. "Just 2 sacks. That is all I ask. The children—" He did not finish. There was no need. Everyone knew what came next. The trader, Phineas Webb, sat comfortably on the buckboard of his wagon, a stark island of prosperity in a sea of want. He was a portly man with a florid face and small, shrewd eyes that missed nothing. His clothes were clean, his boots polished, and a heavy gold watch chain was draped across his ample stomach. His wagon was laden with the very things this town now considered luxuries: sacks of flour and grain, barrels of salted pork, tins of coffee, and bolts of bright calico fabric. He was a vulture, and he knew a dying town when he saw one. Phineas stroked his waxed mustache, letting Jebediah's plea hang in the air. 2 sacks of grain is not a small thing, Jebediah, he said, his voice smooth and reasonable. The roads are hard. The demand is high. My prices reflect the risk. You know I am not an uncharitable man, but business is business. You have no money. Your credit ran out last spring. What do you have to offer me?" Jebediah's shoulders slumped. He had nothing. His cattle were skeletons bleaching in the sun. His fields were barren. He had already sold his wife's wedding band and the last of his good tools. He looked from the trader's smug face to the sacks of life-giving grain, and his gaze finally fell on the silent figure standing beside him. His daughter, Ilara, stood with a stillness that was both unsettling and profound. She was 17, though the harshness of her life had carved a maturity into her features that made her seem older. Her face was a legacy of 2 worlds. From her father, she had a sprinkle of freckles across the bridge of her nose. From her Cherokee mother, who had succumbed to a fever a decade prior. She had high, elegant cheekbones, eyes the color of dark, wet earth, and long. Straight hair, black as a raven's wing, tied back with a simple leather thong. Hardship had been her constant companion, and it had taught her to build walls of silence around herself. Her expression was unreadable, her dark eyes holding a dull, resigned sheen. She had heard this kind of talk before. She knew what she was worth. Phineas Webb's eyes followed Jebediah's gaze. They slid over the girl, appraising her not as a father might, but as a rancher would a prime heifer. He saw the strength in her slender frame, the unblemished skin, the full lips. He saw an asset. "Well now," Phineas said slowly, a greasy smile spreading across his face. "Perhaps you do have something to trade after all." The crowd stirred. A few of the women looked away, their faces tight with disgust. Most of the men remained silent, their own hunger a gnawing beast in their bellies that made them complicit. Who were they to judge a man for trying to feed his family? Jebediah flinched as if struck. A flicker of something, shame, maybe even love, passed through his hollow eyes. "She's my daughter," he whispered, the words barely audible. "She is," Phineas agreed easily. "A fine-looking girl, strong, I have business associates in the East who pay well for good help. Housemates, companions. She would be well cared for. A much better life than this. He gestured with a plump hand at the dust-choked street. 3 sacks of grain, he offered, and a slab of bacon. Think of your other children. Jebediah, the ones who are still small enough to save. The words were a calculated cruelty, a knife twisted in an open wound. Jebediah's head bowed, his resolve crumbling under the weight of his failure. Ilara did not move. She did not look at her father or the trader. She stared straight ahead at the warped siding of the general store, her jaw set, her hands clenched into small, tight fists at her sides. She was a stone, refusing to show a single crack. At the edge of the crowd, a man leaned against a hitching post, half hidden in the shade of the store's overhang. His name was Cole. He was tall and broad-shouldered, though leaner than he used to be after weeks on the trail. His hat was pushed back on his head, revealing a forehead pale in contrast to a face burned brown by the sun. His clothes, denim trousers, a plain cotton shirt, and a worn leather vest, were covered in a uniform layer of dust. He had a stillness about him, but it was different from the girls. His was the quiet of a patient predator, of a man who had learned that most trouble could be avoided by watching and waiting. He had ridden into Redemption Flats for a bag of coffee and a fresh horseshoe, intending to be gone by noon. He had lost his own family years ago. A fever had taken his wife, and the infant son she had given him lasted only 2 days. The memory was a cold, hard stone in his gut, one he carried everywhere. He understood loss. He understood the kind of desperation that made a man consider the unthinkable. But this was different. This was not a surrender to fate. This was a transaction of souls. Jebediah looked at his daughter, his face a ruin of conflict. He saw her dark hair, so like her mother's, and for a moment his resolve hardened. Then he thought of his 2 young sons back at the homestead, their bellies swollen and their cries growing weaker by the day. He let out a ragged breath. 4 sacks, he croaked. 4 sacks of grain and the bacon. Phineas Webb laughed, a short, barking sound. Done, he said, his eyes gleaming. He stood and turned to his wagon as if the matter was settled. That was when the cowboy pushed himself off the hitching post. Cole's voice was not loud, but it had the rough, grating quality of stones grinding together. It cut through the dry wind and the murmuring of the crowd, silencing everything. You're selling her for grain? Every head turned. Cole walked forward, his steps deliberate, his spurs leaving small, star-shaped prints in the dust. He did not look at Jebediah. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were locked on the trader. Phineas Webb, who had been reaching for a burlap sack, froze. He turned, his jovial mask slipping to reveal a harder, more dangerous man underneath. This is a private matter, friend, Phineas said, his voice losing its oily charm. It does not concern you. It does now, Cole said, stopping a few feet from the wagon. He looked at the girl for the first time. Her eyes met his, and for a single, fleeting second, he saw something behind the dull acceptance, a spark, a flicker of wild, defiant fire that had not yet been extinguished. The girl is my property now, Phineas announced, puffing out his chest. A legal arrangement between her father and myself. Cole's gaze shifted back to the trader. A muscle twitched in his jaw. She is not a horse to be traded, and you are not her owner. Phineas's face darkened. He was not accustomed to being challenged, especially not by some trail-worn drifter. I have 2 men with me, he warned, gesturing with his head toward a pair of rough-looking men who had been lounging near the saloon. They began to straighten up, their hands drifting toward the pistols at their hips. I would advise you to mind your own affairs and ride on. Cole ignored the threat. He ignored the hired guns. He took another step forward until he was standing directly in front of Phineas. The trader was a big man, but Cole was taller. his presence radiating a quiet menace that had nothing to do with size and everything to do with a will forged in hardship. What happened next was swift and brutal. Before Phineas could utter another word, Cole's hand shot out and grabbed the front of the trader's fancy vest, twisting the fabric and the gold chain with it. He hauled the heavier man off the buckboard as if he weighed nothing, slamming him hard against the side of the wagon. The impact sent a cloud of dust billowing from the wooden planks. Phineas let out a strangled cry of shock and pain. The crowd gasped. "You will not touch her," Cole said, his voice low and deadly. He held the terrified trader pinned against the wagon with one hand, with the other. He reached into his vest, pulled out a small, worn leather pouch, and threw it onto the dirt at Jebediah's feet. It landed with a soft, metallic clink. "That is $30. It is more than he offered, more than you deserve." He released Phineas, shoving him away. The trader stumbled back, gasping for air, his face purple with rage and humiliation. His two men started forward, their hands now firmly on their guns. Cole did not even look at them. He turned his back on them completely, his attention fixed on Jebediah. "Take the money and buy your grain." Then he looked at Alara. Her face was a mask of stunned disbelief. The dullness was gone from her eyes, replaced by a confusion so profound it was almost painful to see. "I'll take her home myself," Cole declared, his voice ringing with an authority that no one dared to question. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some people jeered, calling him a fool. Others simply watched in stunned silence, their faces grim. They knew what he had just done. He had not just interrupted a business deal. He had challenged the unspoken laws of survival that now governed this place. He had made an enemy of Phineas Webb, a man with money and connections, and he had shamed Jebediah Miller in front of the entire town. Cole paid them no mind. He turned to the girl. "Come on." Alara did not move. She did not thank him. She did not cry with relief. She simply stared at him, her dark eyes searching his face. The look she gave him was not one of gratitude. It was a strange, guarded defiance, a silent question that held a lifetime of mistrust. She had been a piece on a board, moved from one square to another. To her, this was just another move, another man claiming ownership. Cole's expression softened almost imperceptibly. He understood. He did not push her. He just waited. After a long moment, she gave a small, jerky nod. Her father, Jebediah, had already snatched the pouch from the ground and was stumbling toward the general store, his face buried in his hands, not once looking back at the daughter he had sold. Cole walked to his horse, a sturdy buckskin that had carried him across 1,000 miles of unforgiving country. He untied the reins and swung himself into the saddle. He waited as Alara, moving with a stiff, deliberate grace, climbed onto the back of a scrawny mare tied to the trader's wagon, her only possession in the world. They rode out of Redemption Flats under a lowering sky, the sun a hazy, angry orange behind them. A few small dust devils spun in their wake, like restless spirits of the barren land. No one waved, no one called out. The silence that followed them was heavy and judgmental. For hours, they rode east, away from the dying town. The only sounds were the plodding of the horses' hooves and the sigh of the wind through the sagebrush. The silence between them was a chasm, wide and deep. Cole was lost in his own thoughts, a storm of regret already brewing inside him. What in God's name had he been thinking? His ranch was a half-ruined spread he had won in a poker game, a place of broken fences and solitude. It was no place for a young woman. He had barely enough to feed himself, let alone another mouth. He had acted on a raw, buried instinct, a foolish impulse to right a wrong in a world that was full of them. Now, with the heat of his anger fading, the cold reality of his decision settled in. He could not take it back. He could not leave her on the trail. He was tied to her now, by a $30 pouch in a moment of righteous fury. As dusk began to bleed purple and gray across the horizon, he reined in his horse near the skeletal remains of a cottonwood tree that marked a dry creek bed. "We'll make camp here," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She slid off her mare without a word and began gathering brittle twigs for a fire, moving with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. Cole unsaddled the horses, his movements stiff and weary. He set a pot of coffee to boil over the small fire she had built and fried a few strips of bacon in a pan. He offered her a plate, and she took it, her fingers brushing his for a fraction of a second. She flinched, pulling her hand back as if burned. They ate in silence, seated on opposite sides of the crackling fire. The flames cast dancing shadows on their faces, hiding as much as they revealed. When the meal was over, she cleaned the plates with sand and set them aside. The vast, star-dusted sky arched over them, and in the distance, a coyote let out a lone, mournful howl, answered by another. Cole watched her. She sat with her arms wrapped around her knees, staring into the heart of the fire. Her shoulders were tense, her back ramrod straight. She seemed so small and alone in the immense darkness of the prairie. After a long while, she began to speak, but not to him. She whispered, her voice a low, rhythmic murmur. The words were not English. They were soft and flowing, a language he did not recognize, the one her mother must have taught her. She was not praying. She was talking to herself, or perhaps to the ghosts of her past, drawing a circle of sound around herself that he could not penetrate. He leaned back against his saddle, the tin cup of coffee warm in his hands, and a terrible realization washed over him. He had seen himself as her rescuer, a man of principle standing against cruelty. But in her eyes, what was he? He was just the man who had paid a better price. He had not broken the chain of her servitude. He had simply forged a new link. She did not see herself as saved. She saw herself as traded again, from a father to a merchant, and now from a merchant to a stranger. The defiant fire he had seen in her eyes back in town was gone, replaced once more by the dull, hard sheen of acceptance. The weight of it settled on his soul, heavier than any mountain. They rode for another full day before the jagged line of a low mesa appeared on the horizon, and, at its base, a solitary cluster of buildings that looked like they had been dropped from the sky and forgotten. This was Cole's ranch. It was less a homestead and more a testament to stubborn survival. The main house was a small, sturdy structure of sod and timber, but its porch sagged on one end like a weary sigh. A nearby barn listed to the north, its roof patched with mismatched pieces of tin, and the corral fence had gaps wide enough for a whole herd of cattle to wander through. Had he owned a herd, a single windmill stood sentinel, one of its blades missing, turning unevenly in the constant wind with a mournful squeak. The land itself was a harsh canvas of cracked earth and sun-bleached grass. Skeletal cottonwoods lined the dry creek bed, their limbs twisted and bare, here and there. The white crescent of a cattle rib or the hollow-eyed skull of a steer broke the monotony of the brown landscape. It was a place stripped down to its bones, a reflection of the man who called it home, and now, a mirror for the girl he had brought to it. It was a landscape of loss, lonely and stark, and Alara seemed to settle into it as if she were made of the same dust. Cole dismounted and led his horse to the trough, pumping water from the well with a rhythmic groan of the handle. "This is it," he said, the words feeling inadequate. Alara slid from her mare, her movements stiff. She did not look at the house, but at the horizon, as if charting all possible routes of escape. Her gaze lingered on a small, fenced-in plot on a low hill a few hundred yards away, where a single, hardy cedar tree stood guard. "The house has 2 rooms," Cole explained, his voice sounding overloud in the silence. "A kitchen and a bedroom. You can take the bedroom." He led her inside. The main room was sparse, containing a cast-iron stove, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and shelves holding a few tin plates and a sack of flour. It smelled of cold ash, old coffee, and solitude. He pushed open the door to the other room. It was small, with a single window facing east. A simple iron bed frame stood against one wall, covered with a faded but immaculately clean quilt stitched in a pattern of interlocking stars. A small wooden chest sat at the foot of the bed, and a simple washstand with a ceramic basin and pitcher stood in the corner. A ghost lived in this room. Cole could feel her, as he always did. The memory of his wife, Sarah, was woven into the fabric of the quilt she had made, lingering in the faint scent of lavender that still clung to the chest where she had kept her few belongings. He had not slept in this bed since she had died. He had not allowed himself to. Giving this room to Alara felt like a betrayal, a sharp twisting of guilt in his gut. But the alternative, making her sleep on the floor in the main room like a dog, was unthinkable. "It was my wife's room," he said, his voice flat, offering the fact as a simple statement, not an invitation for sympathy. Alara stepped inside, her eyes taking in every detail. She ran a hand over the star quilt, her touch so light it was almost reverent. She looked at Cole, and for a moment, he thought she might speak. Instead, she turned away and began to unpack the small bundle of belongings she had carried with her, which consisted of nothing more than a spare shift and a small, beaded pouch. The days that followed fell into a quiet, strained routine. Alara moved through the small house with the silent, cautious grace of a feral cat. She kept to the edges of rooms, her back often to a wall, her eyes constantly darting toward the door. She was a creature perpetually braced for a blow that never came. She did not speak unless spoken to, and her answers were short, clipped things, small stones of speech offered reluctantly. Cole gave her space. He spent his days from sunup to sundown mending the fences, his hands and muscles finding solace in the familiar, mindless work. He was a man who knew how to fix things that were broken, but he did not know how to fix the silence that had taken root in his home. At night, they would eat together at the small table, the space between them filled only with the scrape of forks on tin plates. A week after their arrival, their supplies ran low. The nearest town, Harmony Creek, was a half-day's ride away. It was bigger and slightly more prosperous than Redemption Flats, boasting a church and a proper sheriff. Cole knew he had to go, and he knew he could not leave her behind. The moment they rode down Harmony Creek's main street, Cole felt the eyes on them. He saw the whispers pass between women clustered outside the mercantile, the way men sitting on the saloon porch stopped their conversations to watch them pass. The story of the cowboy who had bought Jebediah Miller's daughter had traveled faster than they had. He left Alara with the horses and went into the general store. The proprietor, a man named Henderson, greeted him with a nod that was cooler than usual, as Henderson measured out coffee beans. The door creaked open and Reverend Blackwood entered. The preacher was a tall, severe man with a face that seemed incapable of smiling. He was the town's moral compass, and he saw it as his duty to point out when the needle went astray. Mr. Cole," the Reverend said, his voice low and sonorous. He nodded curtly toward the street, where Alara stood holding the reins, her face turned away. "I heard about your act of charity." "It was not charity," Cole said, his tone clipped. "Was it not?" The Reverend raised a skeptical eyebrow. "The good book tells us to care for the widow and the orphan. It does not, however, instruct a man to take a young woman of questionable breeding into his home. Tongues are wagging. Son, they say you are living in sin with her." Cole's hand tightened around the sack of coffee. "Let them say what they want. They do not know a thing about it. They know she is the daughter of a Cherokee woman. They know her father sold her. Such things mark a person," Reverend Blackwood said, his voice laced with a cold piety. "People will say your compassion is a cloak for something baser. Your reputation will suffer. A man's reputation is all he has out here." "My reputation is my own business," Cole said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And that girl's soul is hers." He paid Henderson for his supplies and left the store, his jaw tight with anger. Outside, a group of ranchers loitering near the saloon watched him. One of them spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "That the one, Cole?" he called out, a sneer in his voice. "The Miller half-breed? Heard you paid a high price for her." Cole ignored them, his face a granite mask. He swung the supplies onto his horse and turned to Alara. She had heard them. He could see it in the rigid set of her shoulders, in the way she refused to meet his eyes. The wall of silence around her had grown thicker, higher. They rode home without a word. A few days later, trying to pretend things were normal, Cole asked her to ride into town to fetch a small sack of flour he had forgotten. He thought giving her a task, a purpose, might help. It was a mistake. She was gone for hours longer than necessary. When she finally returned, a storm cloud of misery hung about her. She slid off her mare, dropped the sack of flour on the porch, and went straight to her room, closing the door behind her. Cole found her later, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. Her face was hard, her eyes dry but filled with a familiar, chilling emptiness. "I will not go back there," she said, her voice a dead monotone. "Ever." He did not have to ask why. He could imagine it all, the whispers that became outright stares, the shopkeeper's wife refusing to touch her hand as she gave her the change, the children who pointed, the women who gathered their skirts as she passed. She had been judged, weighed, and found wanting, not for who she was, but for what she was, her blood, her name, her past. From that day on, her silence deepened, but it was accompanied by a new, frantic energy. She began to work as if possessed by a demon of cleanliness and order. She scrubbed the floorboards of the small house until her knuckles were raw, mended his torn shirts with tiny, perfect stitches, and cooked their meager meals with a ferocious concentration. She was trying to repay him. In her world, nothing was given freely. Every act of kindness was a debt to be settled. The $30 he had paid for her was a weight she carried every waking moment, and she was determined to work it off, grain by grain, penny by penny. One evening, he came in from the barn to find her on her hands and knees, scrubbing the hearthstones with a wet rag. The firelight flickered on her face, showing the deep exhaustion etched there. He saw that her hands were chapped and bleeding. "Alara, stop," he said, his voice softer than he intended. She did not look up. "It needs to be cleaned." He walked over and gently took the rag from her hand. Her fingers were stiff and cold. "The floor is clean enough. You have done more than enough. You do not owe me anything." She finally looked up at him, and her eyes were filled with a dark, bitter disbelief. "Everyone owes something," she whispered. It was the longest sentence she had spoken to him. "Not to me," he insisted. "I did what I did because it was the right thing to do. That is all. There is no debt." She pulled her hand away and stood up, wrapping her arms around herself. She did not believe him. His words were from a world she had never known, a language she did not understand. Her father had taught her that her value was measured in sacks of grain. The world had taught her that her blood made her less than whole. How could this man, this stranger, be any different? He was just a kinder master, but a master nonetheless. The distance between them remained, but slowly, imperceptibly, its nature began to change. It was less a chasm of mistrust and more a shared space of quiet sorrow. Fragments of her past emerged, not in conversations, but in unguarded moments. One afternoon, watching him try to patch a leather bridle, she mentioned that her mother had been skilled with beadwork, her hands swift and sure. Another time, he asked about the small pouch she always kept with her. She opened it and showed him a single, smooth, white stone and a hawk's feather. "They were hers," she said, and he knew she meant her mother. She told him, in a flat, emotionless voice, that her father had loved her mother once, but after she died, He began to resent the daughter who looked so much like her. He despised the dark hair, the high cheekbones, the constant, visible reminder of the woman he had lost, and the native blood he had come to see as a stain on his family. As she spoke, Cole found himself thinking of the small grave on the hill. He remembered the blinding pain of losing Sarah, the suffocating helplessness of watching his tiny son, whom they had named Daniel, struggle for breath for 2 short days. He had buried them both himself, under the cedar tree, and a part of him had been buried there with them. He understood what it was to have your world torn away, to be left with nothing but ghosts and the sharp edges of memory. He and the girl were 2 different kinds of survivors, scarred by 2 different kinds of loss, but they were survivors all the same. The grief they both carried, unspoken and unshared, began to fill the silence between them, not with noise, but with a strange and somber understanding. Then, one evening late in the summer, the world changed. The air, which for months had been hot and dry, grew heavy and still. The sky to the west turned a bruised, angry purple. A low rumble of thunder echoed across the plains. Cole stood on the porch, watching the storm roll in, a knot of hope tightening in his chest. Elara came to stand beside him, her presence a quiet question. They watched as the first fat drops of rain began to fall, kicking up little puffs of dust. Then more came, faster and faster, until the drops merged into a solid, driving sheet of water. The sound was a roar, a symphony of life pouring down from the heavens. The smell of rain hitting the parched earth was thick and sweet, the scent of absolution. Lightning tore across the sky, illuminating the plains in a brilliant, ghostly flash, followed by a deafening crash of thunder that shook the very foundations of the small house. The wind whipped the rain into a frenzy, and the world dissolved into a gray, churning chaos. It was violent and beautiful and terrifying. It was a cleansing. They stood there for a long time, side by side, not touching, but closer than they had ever been. They were 2 small figures on a lonely porch, watching the world be washed clean. The rain plastered Elara's dark hair to her face and soaked through her thin dress, but she did not seem to notice. Her head was tilted back, her eyes closed, as if she were drinking in the storm. Cole looked at her, at the profile of her face illuminated by another flash of lightning. He saw the tension that always held her shoulders so rigidly begin to dissolve. The hard line of her mouth softened. And then she did something he had never seen her do before. As the thunder rolled away into the distance, she opened her eyes, turned her head slightly toward him, and smiled. It was not a big smile. It was a faint, hesitant curve of her lips, as fragile and as fleeting as a moonbeam. But it was real. It was the first crack in the frozen surface of her soul, a promise that in this washed and waiting world, something new might finally have a chance to grow. The rain was a baptism. It fell for 3 days and 3 nights, a relentless, life-giving torrent that washed the dust from the air and turned the cracked earth to a dark, thirsty mud. When the sun finally broke through, it illuminated a changed world. Tiny shoots of green grass, impossibly vibrant, pushed their way through the soil. The skeletal cottonwoods along the creek bed seemed to soften, their branches glistening. The world smelled clean and new, pregnant with a hope that had been absent for years. The change was not just in the land. A fragile peace had settled in the small house. The frantic energy had gone out of Elara's work. She still moved with a quiet efficiency, but the wariness in her eyes had lessened, replaced by a watchful curiosity. They had fallen into a rhythm that felt less like a man and his charge, and more like 2 solitary people sharing a space. The silence between them was no longer a wall, but a shared territory, comfortable and understood. Cole found himself mending the last of the fences not with grim determination, but with a sense of purpose. He was not just fixing his ranch. He was building a sanctuary. This fragile peace was shattered on a bright afternoon a week after the rain stopped. Cole was repairing a hinge on the barn door when he saw the riders. There were 3 of them, dark figures cresting the rise to the east. His hand froze, the hammer held aloft. His gut went cold. He knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, who it was. Phineas Webb sat on a fine black gelding, looking even more prosperous than before. His face, however, was not that of a smug merchant. It was tight with a vindictive fury. The humiliation he had suffered in Redemption Flats had festered, turning his greed into something far more personal and venomous. Beside him rode the same two hired guns, their faces impassive and cruel. Cole laid the hammer down slowly and walked out to meet them. Stopping a dozen yards from the house, Elara appeared in the doorway behind him, a shadow in the dim interior. He could feel her stillness, the sudden return of the old animal fear. "Cole," Phineas said, his voice dripping with false cordiality. "I see you have settled in nicely. The rain has been good to this land. What do you want, Webb?" Cole's voice was flat, hard. "What is rightfully mine," the trader said, his smile turning into a sneer. He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. "I took the liberty of visiting the magistrate in the county seat. This is a bill of sale, signed and witnessed. Jebediah Miller sold his daughter's indenture to me for the price of 4 sacks of grain and a side of bacon, a legal and binding contract." "That paper is not worth a spit to seal it," Cole said. "The law disagrees," Phineas shot back, his voice rising. "And it also states that you, by interfering with a legal transaction and absconding with my property, are guilty of theft. You bought her with threats and violence, which nullifies your claim. She belongs to me." He looked past Cole to where Elara stood, his eyes slithering over her. "I have come to collect my purchase." The air grew thick with menace. The two hired guns shifted in their saddles, their hands resting near their pistols. Cole did not move. He was a stone wall, a bulwark between the man on the horse and the girl in the doorway. "You will leave my land now," he said, his voice dangerously low. Phineas laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Your land? This broken patch of dirt? I think not. I will have the girl, or I will have the sheriff come and take her for me. And you, my friend, will find yourself in a jail cell." He wheeled his horse around. "We will be in Harmony Creek. You have until noon tomorrow to bring her in. After that, I will come back with the law on my side." They rode away, leaving a trail of trampled new grass and poisoned silence. Cole turned and looked at Elara. The hope that had begun to blossom in her face had been utterly extinguished. She was once again the girl from Redemption Flats, her eyes dull with the expectation of betrayal. The next morning, they rode to Harmony Creek. Cole knew it was a fool's errand, but he had to try. He told Elara to wait at the edge of town, a command she obeyed with a numb, silent resignation. Sheriff Brody's office was small and smelled of stale cigar smoke. The sheriff himself was a man in his 50s with a weary face and a drooping mustache. He listened to Cole's story, his expression impassive, then looked at the bill of sale Phineas Webb had already presented to him. "The paper looks legal, Cole," Brody said, rubbing his tired eyes. "It has Miller's mark on it, and a witness's signature." "It was made under duress. He was starving his family," Cole argued, his voice tight with frustration. "You cannot sell a person like a sack of potatoes." "The law gets murky on these things," the sheriff said, avoiding his gaze. "Indentures, apprenticeships. Webb claims he was taking her on as an indentured servant to work for a family back east. Miller agreed to it. As for you, well, Webb and his men say you assaulted him and stole her. It is their word against yours." "So you are going to let him take her?" Cole asked, his voice laced with disbelief. Sheriff Brody sighed and stood up, walking to the window. He looked out at the main street, where Phineas Webb was holding court outside the saloon, buying drinks for a group of local ranchers. "Look, Cole, Webb is a man of business. He brings goods this town needs. You are a newcomer, a man who keeps to himself. People are already whispering about you and that girl. They say it is not right. The preacher is against you. The whole town. They see this as Webb's business. They want it settled. They do not want trouble. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. The law was not a set of rules carved in stone. It was a current, and it flowed in the direction of power and public opinion. "I will not hand her over," Cole said, his voice as cold and hard as iron. The sheriff turned from the window, his face grim. "Then I am giving you a friendly warning. Get on your horses and ride out. Do not be in this county by nightfall. If you are, I will have no choice but to come for you with a posse. And they will not be as friendly as me." Cole walked out of the office into the hostile sunlight. He did not have to tell Alara what had happened. She saw it on his face. She saw it in the way the townspeople turned their backs on them. She saw it in the triumphant smirk on Phineas Webb's face as he watched them from the saloon porch. "We have to go," Cole said, his voice rough. "Now!" They fled. They pushed their horses hard, heading not east or west on the open plains, but north toward the jagged, unforgiving terrain of the high country. It was their only chance to lose the men that would surely follow. The sky, which had been so clear, began to cloud over. A cold wind swept down from the mountains, carrying the promise of another storm. By nightfall, they were deep in the rocky foothills, and the rain had begun again. It was a cold, miserable downpour that turned the game trails into slick rivers of mud. They were chased not just by Phineas Webb's men, but by hunger, exhaustion, and the biting cold. For 2 days, they pushed onward and upward, stopping only for brief, fitful periods of rest in the inadequate shelter of rock overhangs. The pristine beauty of the wilderness was stripped away, revealing its raw, indifferent cruelty. The hardship, however, did what comfort never could. It stripped away their silence and pretense. On the 3rd night, huddled under a leaking canvas tarp, sharing the last of their hardtack, Alara finally spoke. Her voice was low and raspy, almost lost in the sound of the rain. "This is not the first time," she said, staring into the darkness. Cole waited, his silence an invitation. "My father," she continued, her words coming slowly, as if she were pulling them from a great depth. "When I was 14, a trapper came through. He had whiskey and silver coins. My father was in a bad way. He made a deal. The trapper could have me for the winter, in his cabin up north, for a price." Cole felt a cold rage clench in his stomach, but he remained still, letting her talk. "I ran away," she whispered. "I lived in the woods for a week, eating berries, sleeping in hollow logs, like an animal. When I came back, he was angry. Not because he had missed me, but because I had ruined his deal. He told me I was an ungrateful girl, that my mother's wild blood had made me worthless." She paused, taking a shuddering breath. "After that, I swore I would never trust another man. They only ever want to own you, or sell you." She fell silent, the weight of her confession hanging between them in the cold, damp air. Cole did not offer empty words of comfort. He did not tell her he was different. He just sat there in the dark, listening, his presence a solid, unwavering thing. His silence was no longer a mystery to her. It was a quiet space where she could finally lay down a piece of her unbearable burden. It was a form of kindness she had never known. The next day, the storm broke, but their flight was far from over. Alara's worn-out boots had rubbed her feet raw, and by afternoon, she was limping badly, her face pale with pain. Cole found a shallow cave that offered better shelter, a place that looked like it might have been the start of an old mine shaft. "We will rest here," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He built a small, smokeless fire deep inside the cave. In the dim, flickering lantern light, he knelt before her. "Let me see your feet." She recoiled, pulling her legs back.
"They are fine."
"Elara," he said, his voice gentle but firm. He did not wait for her permission. He carefully pulled off her soaked boot. Her sock was bloody, and the skin on her heel was rubbed away, raw and blistering. She winced, biting her lip to keep from crying out. Without a word, he took a clean rag from his saddlebag, soaked it with water from his canteen, and began to clean the wound. His touch was surprisingly tender, his large, calloused hands moving with a careful precision. He tore a strip from his own shirt and bandaged her foot as best he could. She watched him the entire time, her dark eyes wide in the lantern light. Her expression was one of profound confusion. This was an act of pure, unadorned kindness. It was not a payment, not a trade. It asked for nothing in return. It was a language her soul barely remembered how to speak, and it unnerved her more than any cruelty. The next morning, the world was reborn in the clean, crisp air of the high country. As Cole was gathering their things, a dry, buzzing rattle echoed off the cave walls. He froze, not 5 feet away. Coiled in a patch of sunlight near his saddle was a large rattlesnake, its head raised, its tail a blur. It had been drawn out by the morning warmth. Before Cole could even reach for his pistol, there was a deafening crack. The snake's head exploded in a spray of dust and blood. Elara stood at the mouth of the cave, smoke curling from the barrel of the old revolver Cole had given her for protection. Her hands were steady, her face calm and focused. She had not screamed. She had not panicked. She had seen the threat and eliminated it. Cole stared from the dead snake to her, and for the first time, he saw her not as a victim he had rescued, not as a burden he had taken on, but as a partner. She was a survivor, forged in a fire he could only imagine. A deep, profound respect bloomed in his chest. "Good shot," he said, the words an inadequate measure of what he felt. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and reloaded the pistol. The dynamic between them had shifted, subtly but irrevocably. He stopped looking at her with pity, and she stopped hiding from him behind a wall of silence. As they traveled deeper into the mountains, they began to talk, at night, by the fire. They exchanged stories, not of their lives, but of their dead. She told him about her mother, a woman who knew the names of all the stars and could weave stories from the rustling of the leaves. She spoke of her gentleness, her laughter, and the emptiness she had left behind. In turn, Cole found himself speaking of Sarah for the first time in years. He told Elara about his wife's fierce love for the land, her dream of having a real home, a place filled with children. He spoke of the night she had died, of the terrible, agonizing choice the doctor had given him, and of the tiny, perfect son he had held for 2 days before burying him beside his mother under the cedar tree. Their shared grief became a bridge between them. It was a somber, sacred ground where their 2 lonely souls could meet. They were no longer just a man and a girl running from danger. They were 2 people who understood the geography of loss, who had learned to navigate the world with a piece of their heart missing. Their luck ran out 5 days later, while tracking a deer for food. Cole slipped on a wet rock, and a sharp branch tore a deep gash in his thigh. He cleaned it as best he could, but within a day, the wound was red and swollen. By evening, a fever had taken hold of him. He shivered uncontrollably, his mind fogged with delirium. He remembered collapsing by a stream, the world tilting and fading to black. He had fleeting moments of consciousness, the feeling of cool water on his forehead, the taste of a bitter tea made from willow bark, the sensation of being dragged into a shallow shelter of pine boughs. Through the haze of fever, he was aware of her constant presence. She was always there, a determined, tireless shadow, refusing to leave him. She could have taken his horse, his gun, and ridden away. She could have left him to die, but she stayed. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. He woke to the sound of quiet weeping. His vision was blurry, but he could make out her form, huddled by the dying embers of the fire, her shoulders shaking. He was weak, his body ached, but his mind was clear. He realized she was not weeping for him, not entirely. She was weeping for the cruel irony of it all. She had finally found a person who saw her as more than property, who treated her with a kindness that had begun to heal the deepest cracks in her soul, only to be faced with losing him in the heart of a merciless wilderness. She was weeping for him, and for herself, and for the fragile, impossible hope that was in danger of being extinguished. "Elara," he whispered, his voice a dry croak. Her head snapped up. Her face was tear-streaked, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and overwhelming relief. He was alive. And in that moment, in the raw, unguarded look she gave him, he saw everything she could not say. Cole's strength gave out 2 miles later. He slid from his saddle, his body a dead weight, and collapsed onto a carpet of pine needles. Elara, her own exhaustion a heavy cloak on her shoulders, managed to get him to drink from the canteen before he succumbed to a feverish, fitful sleep. She spent the night watching over him, her old revolver across her lap, listening to the sounds of the forest and the ragged sound of his breathing. When dawn broke, pale and gray, she knew he could not go on. Their flight was over. With a strength born of sheer desperation, she managed to get him onto his horse. She led the 2 animals through the dense timber, with no destination in mind, only a vague sense of moving away from the past and into an uncertain future. An hour later, the trees thinned, and she stumbled into a clearing. Before her lay a small, nestled valley she had not seen on any map. In the center of it was a ranch. Unlike Cole's broken-down spread, this place was an island of order and tranquility. A neat log cabin with a stone chimney puffed a welcoming plume of smoke into the morning air. Fences were straight and true, enclosing a pasture where a half-dozen healthy cows grazed on lush grass. A well-tended garden grew next to the house. It was a haven. An old woman was on the porch, splitting kindling with an axe. She handled the tool with an easy, practiced competence. She was slender and wiry, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, but her eyes, when she looked up and saw them, were as sharp and clear as a hawk's. She set the axe down and watched them approach, her expression neither alarmed nor surprised. "He is hurt," Elara said, the words catching in her throat. It was the first time she had initiated a conversation with a stranger since Redemption Flats. The woman's sharp eyes took in everything, Cole's fever-bright eyes and the crude bandage on his thigh, Elara's exhausted frame and the fierce, protective way she held the reins. She saw the desperation and the strange, deep bond that tethered these 2 lost souls together. "Bring him inside," the woman said simply, her voice raspy but kind. "I am Martha Talbot, and it looks like you 2 have seen your share of trouble." She asked no questions about who they were or what they were running from. She saw a need, and she met it. That was her way. The following weeks were a time of strange and quiet magic. Mrs. Talbot's home was a place of healing, a sanctuary from the harshness of the world they had left behind. Cole's fever raged for 2 days, and Martha nursed him with herbal remedies and a no-nonsense tenderness. Elara rarely left his side, changing the cool cloths on his forehead, forcing him to drink broth, her movements silent and devoted. When the fever finally broke and Cole was on the mend, a new rhythm established itself under Martha's roof. Elara began to uncurl like a frost-bitten flower in the spring sun. The old widow, with a wisdom that needed few words, began to teach her things her own mother never had the chance to. She showed Elara how to knead bread, her gnarled hands guiding Elara's until the dough was smooth and pliant. She taught her how to mend clothes with neat, invisible stitches, how to churn butter, and how to identify the wild herbs that grew in the valley. For the first time since she was a small child, Elara was in the presence of a nurturing, motherly figure. Martha never pitied her. She treated her with a straightforward respect that was more healing than any amount of sympathy. One afternoon, while they were feeding the chickens, Martha told a dry, funny story about her late husband's attempt to shoe a stubborn mule. Ilara, caught off guard, let out a small, breathy laugh. The sound was so unfamiliar that she immediately clapped a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with surprise. Martha just smiled, a knowing, gentle expression on her face. "It is good to hear that sound in this house again," she said softly. Cole, meanwhile, regained his strength through labor. As soon as he could stand without swaying, he began to earn their keep. He chopped a mountain of firewood, stacking it neatly against the cabin wall. He repaired the section of fence the cows had knocked loose. He rehung a barn door that had been sagging on its hinges. The physical work was a balm to his soul, but his mind was never at rest. Every morning he would stand on the porch and scan the horizon. His eyes narrowed, searching for any sign of riders. He knew Phineas Webb was not a man to give up easily. Their peace was fragile, a beautiful bubble that could be burst at any moment. This knowledge kept him from fully settling, a quiet tension humming just beneath his skin. He was a guardian on a wall, and he could not afford to rest. He watched Ilara change, and it filled him with a feeling he could not name. It was more than pride, deeper than affection. He saw her confidence grow. Martha taught her to ride properly, not just to stay on a horse, but to move with it, to feel its rhythm. He watched her canter across the pasture, her dark hair flying behind her, her face alive with a joy he had never seen before. The haunted, wary girl was being replaced by a strong, vibrant young woman, and she was beautiful. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow, leaving him feeling breathless and profoundly unsettled. One bright, warm afternoon, he found her by the creek that ran through the valley. She was kneeling on a flat stone, washing their clothes, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. The sunlight filtered through the leaves of the aspen trees, dappling her skin. The sound of the water and the quiet hum of insects filled the air. She seemed so at peace, so completely a part of this tranquil scene, that he hesitated to disturb her. She must have sensed his presence, for she looked up, her hands still in the water. She watched him for a long moment, her expression serious. Then she asked the question that had lain unspoken between them since the beginning. "Why did you take me that day?" Her voice was soft, barely more than a whisper over the sound of the creek. Cole walked closer and sat on a fallen log. He looked at the clear water, at the way it swirled around the rocks. He thought of all the possible answers, because it was the right thing to do. Because Phineas Webb was a monster. Because he felt sorry for her. None of them felt true enough. He finally met her gaze, his own eyes holding a deep, ancient sorrow. "I do not rightly know," he admitted, his voice rough with honesty. I looked at you standing there, and I looked at your father, and I looked at that traitor, and I saw something breaking. Not just in you, in all of them. It felt like I was watching a man sell his own soul to feed his body." He paused, his gaze turning inward, toward the graves on the hill at his own ranch. "I have seen what loss can do. I know how it can hollow a person out until there is nothing left but desperation. I guess I just could not stand by and watch another soul be lost for good." He had not rescued her to be a hero. He had done it because her predicament had struck the deepest, most wounded part of himself. He had done it out of a profound, almost primal empathy. Ilara stared at him, her lips slightly parted. She had expected a simple answer, an explanation rooted in pity or duty. She had not expected this. He had not seen her as a thing to be saved, but as a person whose spirit was in peril, and it had resonated with the peril of his own. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, and she did not bother to wipe it away. That night, the charged silence returned. But it was different. It was no longer a silence of caution and grief, but one of longing and unspoken questions. After their simple dinner, Cole went to the barn to check on the horses, needing the familiar comfort of their presence to soothe his restless heart. He was brushing down his buckskin when he heard a soft footstep behind him. Alara stood in the wide doorway, a silhouette against the moonlit yard. She was holding one of his mended shirts in her hands. "I wanted to thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "for what you said today, and for everything." She stepped into the warm, hay-scented darkness of the barn. The lantern cast a golden glow, illuminating the fine strands of her hair and the deep, searching look in her eyes. She walked toward him until she was standing so close he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. She lifted a hand and gently touched his arm, her fingers light and hesitant. "You are a good man, Cole," she whispered. Every instinct in him screamed. A fire, banked for years, roared to life in his blood. He wanted to pull her into his arms, to kiss her until the ghosts that haunted them both fled into the shadows. He saw the same desire mirrored in her eyes, a raw, vulnerable need that was as powerful as his own. But he could not. The world's judgment, the preacher's warning, the difference in their ages, the way she had come into his life, it all stood between them like a wall of glass. He was her protector. To take advantage of the feelings that had grown in this fragile sanctuary felt like a betrayal worse than any Phineas Webb could conceive. He put his hand over hers, his touch gentle but firm, and slowly lowered her arm. "Alara," he said, his voice thick with a pain that was almost unbearable. "You do not have to thank me." The rejection, however gentle, struck her like a physical blow. The light in her eyes flickered and died. Shame and confusion washed over her face. She pulled her hand back as if she had been burned, took a step back, and then another. Without another word, she turned and fled from the barn. Cole stood there, his heart hammering against his ribs, torn between the desperate urge to go after her and the grim, decent part of him that knew he had done the only thing he could. He did not see her for the rest of the evening. He assumed she had gone to the small loft room Martha had given her. Later, as he sat with the old widow by the fire, she looked at him with her knowing eyes. "She has come to care for you a great deal," Martha said quietly. Cole stared into the flames, his face a mask of conflict. "She is just grateful." "A woman knows the difference between gratitude and love," Martha said, her voice soft but unyielding. "And so do you." She leaned forward, her expression serious. "Be careful, Cole. You are a good man, but if you love her, the world will not forgive you for it. It will see her blood, and it will see your kindness as a sin. A love like that can bring a world of ruin down on you both." A floorboard creaked in the hallway just outside the room. A soft gasp, quickly stifled. Cole's head snapped up. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that Alara had been standing there. She had heard every word. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor, but when he reached the hallway, it was empty. The door to the porch was slightly ajar, letting in the cool night air. He knew what she had heard, and he knew how she would interpret it. She would not hear a warning about the world's cruelty. She would hear a confirmation of her deepest fear, that she was a curse, a source of trouble, and that her very presence would destroy the one person who had ever shown her true decency. A storm was building in the west, the same way one had brewed the night of their flight. The wind began to howl around the corners of the cabin. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. He grabbed his coat and ran outside. Calling her name, there was no answer but the wind. The horse she had come to favor was gone from the corral. He saddled his buckskin with frantic, clumsy hands and rode out into the rising storm. He followed her tracks in the moonlight as long as he could, until the first drops of rain began to fall, turning the dust to mud and erasing her trail. He rode on, blind, trusting his instincts, his heart a cold knot of terror in his chest. He shouted her name into the wind, the sound swallowed by the roar of the thunder. An hour later, a flash of lightning illuminated a huddled shape at the base of a tall cliff face. He rode toward it, his heart pounding. It was her. She was huddled on the ground, soaked to the skin, trembling from cold and misery, her horse standing over her protectively. He swung down from his horse and rushed to her side, dropping to his knees. "Ilara, what were you thinking?" She looked up at him, her face pale and tear-streaked in the flashing lightning. Her eyes were filled with a terrible, broken anguish. "I heard her," she choked out, her teeth chattering. "She is right. I only bring ruin. I will not be the reason the world destroys you." "To hell with the world!" he roared over the thunder. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip desperate. "The world does not matter. You matter." "No," she cried, trying to pull away. "I cannot bear it. Cole, I cannot bear your pity. I do not want you to save me anymore."
"This is not about pity,"
he shouted, his face inches from hers.
"Then what is it?"
she sobbed, her voice breaking.
"What do you want from me?"
And then the truth, raw and undeniable, poured out of her. "I want you," she confessed, her voice dropping to a trembling whisper that was nearly lost in the storm. "Not your mercy, not your protection. I want you." The world fell away. There was only the sound of the rain, the thunder, and her words. He saw it all in her eyes, the fierce pride, the desperate longing, the terror of her own admission. He saw a woman, not a girl, claiming her own heart, her own desire, in the face of a world that would deny her both. Slowly, he lowered his head. Their first kiss was not soft or gentle. It was hesitant, then desperate. A collision of chattering teeth and trembling lips. It tasted of rain and salt, and a need so profound it felt like coming home after a lifetime in exile. It was a kiss born of exhaustion and fear, and a love that had grown, wild and defiant, in the cruelest of soil. Above them, the thunder rolled away into the distance, and for a moment, the relentless rain seemed to soften, falling around them not like a storm, but like a benediction. They returned to the valley as the moon was rising, two riders moving as one shadow. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and cold and smelling of wet pine. Martha Talbot was waiting on the porch, a lantern held high. She took one look at their faces, at the rain-soaked clothes clinging to their frames, at the way Cole's hand rested on Ilara's arm, at the fierce, undeniable truth shining in their eyes. And she knew. She did not say a word of reproach. She simply nodded, her expression a complex mixture of deep affection and profound sorrow for the road she knew lay ahead of them. For a short time, the valley was a bubble of peace in a hostile world. The awkwardness that had once defined the space between Cole and Ilara was gone, replaced by a quiet, reverent intimacy. A single glance across the dinner table could convey a whole conversation. A brief touch of his hand on the small of her back as they passed in the narrow hallway was enough to send a jolt of warmth through her entire body. They moved around each other with the silent, intuitive grace of two people who had found their other half. Ilara's laughter, once a rare and startling sound, became more frequent. Cole's face lost some of its harsh, weary lines, and in unguarded moments, a genuine smile would touch his lips. They were living on borrowed time, and this knowledge made every shared sunset, every quiet meal intensely precious. The bubble was destined to burst. A lone trapper, passing through the high country on his way to Harmony Creek, saw the smoke from Martha's chimney and stopped for a cup of coffee. He recognized Cole from the wanted posters Phineas Webb had plastered in every settlement for 100 miles, for the theft of indentured property. The trapper drank his coffee, said his thank yous, and rode on, his mind on the reward money. The end of their peace came 4 days later. It arrived not with a warning, but with the sudden thunder of a dozen horses storming into the valley. Cole was at the woodpile, his axe raised. When he heard them, he dropped the axe and sprinted for the house, his hand already on the pistol at his hip. Ilara and Martha rushed onto the porch, their faces pale. Phineas Webb sat at the head of the posse, his face flushed with triumph. He had not just brought his 2 hired guns this time. Behind him sat a grim-faced Sheriff Brody and 10 men from Harmony Creek. their faces a mixture of self-righteous anger and grim excitement. They were not lawmen. They were a mob, deputized by their own prejudice. They had been fed a steady diet of Webb's lies, stories of a violent thief who had stolen a helpless girl for his own sinful purposes.
It is over. Cole!
Webb shouted, his voice ringing with satisfaction. There is nowhere left to run. This is private land, Cole said, his voice dangerously calm. He stood on the top step of the porch, positioning himself in front of the two women. You have no right to be here. I have a warrant from a judge and a posse to serve it, Sheriff Brody said, though he refused to meet Cole's eyes. He held up a piece of paper.
Give us the girl, Cole, and surrender yourself. Do not make this harder than it needs to be.
She is not property, Cole said, his voice like stone, and I will not surrender her to him. The men in the posse shifted, their hands moving to their rifles. They saw a defiant man protecting a woman of mixed blood, and it offended their sense of order. Martha Talbot stepped forward, her small frame rigid with indignation. You should all be ashamed of yourselves, she spat, her voice cracking like a whip. Hounding these children. You call yourselves men? One of the ranchers laughed.
Stay out of this, old woman, before you get hurt.
Webb's patience snapped. Take him, he snarled. Cole drew his pistol, but he did not raise it to fire. He knew a gunfight would mean death for them all. It was a standoff, a hopeless one. Before he could make a move, two men slid from their horses and rushed him from the side. He fought back, a silent, desperate whirlwind of fists and fury. He landed a solid punch that sent one man sprawling, but the other tackled him around the legs. He went down hard. The breath knocked from his lungs. The rest of them swarmed him, their boots and fists rising and falling in a brutal, methodical rhythm. Ilara screamed, a raw, piercing sound of pure agony. She tried to run to him, but one of Webb's men grabbed her, his thick arm wrapping around her waist and lifting her off the ground. She fought like a cornered wildcat, kicking and scratching, but it was no use. She could only watch in horror as they beat the man she loved into the dirt. They stopped only when Sheriff Brody finally intervened, pulling the men off Cole's limp form.
That is enough,
the sheriff said, his voice strained.
He is under arrest.
They hauled Cole to his feet. His face was a swollen, bloody mask, but his eyes, when he found Ilara's, were still clear and defiant. They bound his hands behind his back and threw him over his own saddle. Then they came for Ilara. As they dragged her toward a spare horse, she looked back at the ranch, at Martha's stricken face, at the home where she had finally known peace and laughter. A wave of suffocating shame washed over her. It was just as she had feared. Her love had brought nothing but ruin. They were dragged back to Harmony Creek like trophies of a hunt. Cole was thrown into the town's single jail cell. Ilara was locked in the dark, windowless storeroom behind the mercantile. It was cold and smelled of damp earth, rotting potatoes, and rat droppings. A heavy bar was dropped across the outside of the door, sealing her in darkness. She was Webb's property now, guarded by one of his men, to be held until he could arrange for a wagon to take her east. Her first hours were a blur of despair. She huddled in a corner, wrapping her arms around herself, consumed by the image of Cole's beaten face. But Ilara had been forged in a hard fire. Despair was a luxury she had never been able to afford for long. As the hours wore on, her grief slowly hardened into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. She would not let this be the end. She would not let Cole's sacrifice be for nothing. She began to explore her prison, her hands feeling along the rough wooden walls in the pitch black, searching for any weakness. Meanwhile, Martha Talbot rode into town, her face set like granite. She stormed into the sheriff's office without knocking. "You are a coward, Sam Brody," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "Letting that mob beat him like that, letting that snake Webb steal that child? Is there any decency left in you?" The sheriff sat heavily in his chair, looking 100 years old. My hands are tied. Martha, the law is the law. Webb has the papers.
The law? She scoffed. You call that mob the law? You know in your heart this is wrong. That girl has suffered enough in her life. And Cole is a better man than any of those thugs you ride with. Let them go.
I cannot, he said, his voice a weary whisper. It is out of my hands now. Martha looked at his defeated face, and she knew she would find no help from him. She turned and left, her mind already racing, searching for another way. In his cell, Cole drifted in and out of a painful consciousness. Every part of his body ached. One of his eyes was swollen shut. He tasted blood. Late in the afternoon, the cell door creaked open, and Phineas Webb entered. A bottle of whiskey in his hand, he poured a drink for himself, his movements smug and leisurely. You see, Cole, Webb said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. This is how the world works. Order is restored. Property is returned to its rightful owner. He took a sip. But I am a reasonable man. I'm willing to be merciful. All you have to do is sign a statement. Testify that the girl went with you willingly, that you were merely sheltering her until I could be found. Renounce any claim to her. Admit she belongs to me. You do that, and I will persuade the sheriff to let you go. You can ride out of here and forget any of this ever happened. Cole pushed himself into a sitting position, every movement an agony. He looked at Webb through his one good eye, and a slow, bloody smile spread across his lips.
I will see you in hell first,
he rasped. Webb's face contorted in a flash of fury. He threw the rest of the whiskey in Cole's face. Then you will hang, he hissed. And I will take the girl, and I will make sure she remembers this day for the rest of her miserable life. He stormed out, slamming the cell door behind him. Cole leaned his head back against the cold stone wall and closed his eyes. He had made his choice. Night fell, in the storeroom. Ilara's searching hands found it, a loose board at the back, near the floor. It had been gnawed by rats. Working with a frantic, desperate quiet, she began to pry at it with her fingernails. Splinters drove deep into her fingers, but she ignored the pain. After what felt like an eternity, the board came free, opening a hole just wide enough for her to squeeze through. She wriggled into the narrow, dark space under the building and crawled on her belly through dirt and cobwebs until she emerged in the alley behind the mercantile. She was free. The town was dark and quiet, with only a few lights burning in the saloon. Barefoot, she crept through the shadows, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She reached the sheriff's office. A single lamp burned inside. Peeking through the grimy window, she saw the guard Webb had posted. He was slumped in the sheriff's chair, his hat tilted over his eyes, a bottle of whiskey dangling from his hand. He was fast asleep. Slowly, carefully, she eased the door open. It groaned in protest, and she froze, her blood turning to ice. The guard snorted in his sleep but did not wake. On the wall, a ring of iron keys hung from a nail. Holding her breath, she tiptoed across the floor, her bare feet making no sound. She lifted the keys from the hook, their weight a cold, heavy promise in her hand. She backed out of the office and crept to the cell door at the side of the building. She fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking so badly she could barely fit one into the lock. After several tries, the lock clicked open. She pulled the heavy door open and slipped inside.
Cole,
she whispered into the darkness. He was on his feet in an instant, the shape of him a deeper shadow against the dark. Ilara? His voice was a raw sound of disbelief and overwhelming relief. He came to her, and his arms went around her, pulling her against him in a fierce, desperate embrace. For a moment, they just held each other, two fugitives clinging together in the dark heart of a hostile town.
We have to go,
she whispered, pulling away. They crept out of the jail and into the alley. The first pale light of dawn was beginning to streak the eastern sky.
They needed horses. Their only chance was the livery stable at the far end of the street.
They had made it halfway there when a shout cut through the morning stillness.
They are out! They are escaping!
The drunken guard stood in the doorway of the sheriff's office, pointing a shaking finger at them. Lights began to appear in windows. Doors were thrown open. Within minutes, the street was filled with the half-dressed, angry men of the posse, rifles in hand. At their head was Phineas Webb, his face a mask of pure rage. They were surrounded, trapped in the middle of the street as the sun began to rise.
She is mine!
Webb screamed, his voice cracking with fury.
That property belongs to me.
The crowd murmured its agreement, their sleep-addled minds once again inflamed with righteous indignation. Cole pushed Alara behind him, drawing his pistol. He did not aim it at any one person. He held it in front of him, a clear and final statement. He was not a killer, but he would die before he let them take her again. The crowd hesitated, unwilling to be the first to step into the path of a desperate man's bullet. The moment stretched, silent and taut, the whole world holding its breath. A single sharp crack of a rifle shot shattered the silence. It did not come from the crowd. It came from above. Phineas Webb's eyes went wide with shock. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of his chest. He looked down at it, a comical expression of surprise on his face. He took one stumbling step forward and then collapsed into the dust, his own blood pooling around him. The crowd stood frozen for a beat, then scattered in a panic, their mob courage dissolving in the face of sudden, real death. Cole's eyes shot up to the roof of the mercantile. In the golden light of the rising sun, he saw a small, wiry figure standing there, a long rifle held in her hands. Martha Talbot. Sheriff Brody was the only one who had not run. He stood over Webb's body, his pistol still in its holster. He looked at the dead traitor, then at the bloodied and exhausted couple in the middle of the street. His gaze drifted up to the old woman on the roof, who now stood watching him, her rifle held loosely at her side. A long, weary sigh escaped his lips. He had been given a choice between the letter of a corrupt law and the spirit of a harsh but undeniable justice. He walked over to Cole and Alara, his footsteps heavy in the dust. He did not look at them with anger, but with a profound and weary sadness. "You have both suffered enough," he said quietly. He turned his back on them and walked toward Webb's body, as if to attend to the tedious paperwork of a death he had no interest in investigating. It was not a pardon. It was a dismissal. Cole took Ilara's hand. Without looking back, they walked to the livery, took their horses, and rode out of Harmony Creek. The sun was rising behind them, casting their long shadows before them, painting the dust-choked horizon in shades of blood and gold. They were free, and they were utterly alone. They rode for weeks, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the life that had nearly destroyed them. They traveled west, but not on the main trails crowded with wagon trains and fortune-seekers. They sought the empty spaces on the map, the forgotten corners of the vast territory where the law was a distant rumor and a person could disappear. They were searching not for fortune, but for obscurity. They found it in a wide, shallow basin cradled by a low range of sun-scorched mesas. The soil was thin and rocky, the grass sparse. A narrow, seasonal creek cut a meandering path through the land, its banks lined with hardy willow and a few stubborn cottonwoods. It was not a paradise. It was not the rich, loamy farmland that settlers fought and died for. It was unwanted, overlooked, and for that reason, it was perfect. It was a place where no one would think to look for them. Here, they stopped. Here, they began to build. Their first home was not much more than a dugout, a shelter dug into the side of a small hill, reinforced with timber and sod. It was cramped and dark, but it was theirs, and it was safe. With their own 4 hands, they cleared the rocks from a small plot of land near the creek. They dug a well, a back-breaking task that took weeks of sweat and prayer. And when they finally hit a vein of cool, clear water, they held each other and wept with a relief so profound it felt like a physical weight lifting from their shoulders. Months passed. Seasons turned. The raw, desperate urgency of their flight softened into the steady, demanding rhythm of survival. Slowly, painstakingly, they carved a life from the unforgiving land. They built a proper cabin, cutting and shaping the logs themselves, fitting them together with a satisfying finality. Cole taught Alara how to hunt, and she proved to have a steadier hand and a better eye than he did. She could sit motionless for hours, a part of the landscape, until a deer or an antelope wandered into her sights. He, in turn, was a master of the axe and the spade, his strength and endurance seemingly endless. They worked as partners, equals in every task. She was no longer the silent, haunted girl he had taken from Redemption Flats. The harshness of the land and the security of his love had forged her into a woman of quiet, formidable strength. The fear that had lived in her eyes for so long was replaced by a clear, confident light. She moved with a purpose, her body lean and strong from hard work, and she laughed. Her laughter, once a sound so rare it was startling, now came easily. It was a full, unguarded sound that the wind would sometimes catch and carry across the basin, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that was more beautiful to Cole than any bird song. They were happy, but peace, once found, is a skittish and fragile thing. The past does not simply vanish. It leaves scars, phantom limbs that ache when the weather changes. Sometimes, Alara would wake in the dead of night with a scream caught in her throat, her body rigid with a terror she could not name. She would be back in the storeroom, the darkness pressing in, or in the grip of the man who had dragged her from the cabin, the memory of his rough hands of physical violation. On those nights, Cole would simply hold her, his solid presence a silent anchor in the storm of her memory. He would say nothing, for he knew words were useless. He would just hold her until the trembling stopped and her breathing evened out, his steadfastness a quiet promise that she was safe, that she would never be taken again. Cole had his own ghosts. He never spoke of them, but she saw them. Whenever a thunderstorm would roll in, the crash of thunder echoing off the mesas, a shadow would pass over his face. His body would go tense, his hands clenching into fists. The sound was too much like the crack of rifles, the roar of the mob. She learned, in those moments, to go to him and take his hand. She would not speak of the storm. Instead, she would begin to sing, her voice low and soft. She sang the songs her mother had taught her, ancient melodies in the Cherokee tongue that spoke of the rain, the earth, and the sky. The songs were a language older than fear, and they would soothe the savage thing the thunder awoke in him. They learned to be guardians of each other's broken places. Slowly, painstakingly, they learned to trust the peace. They learned that the morning would come without new threats, that the sound of a rider in the distance was likely just a coyote, that the quiet of the night was a blessing, not a prelude to terror. In the long evenings, by the light of a tallow lamp, a new chapter of their life began. Cole had packed one book in his saddlebags, a worn, leather-bound copy of the works of Shakespeare, a relic from a life he had lived long before he had become a cowboy. He opened it and began to teach her to read. Her mind, he discovered, was sharp and hungry. She learned the letters quickly, her brow furrowed in concentration, her finger tracing the strange shapes as he pronounced them. They started with simple words: sun, moon, creek, home. Then they moved on to sentences. The first full sentence she ever read aloud was from one of the plays. Love, she read, her voice hesitant but clear. Comforts like sunshine after rain. She looked up at him, her dark eyes shining with a wonder so profound it made his heart ache. He was not just giving her words, he was giving her a key to the entire world, a world beyond the harsh confines of her own experience. Their heads would bend close together over the book, her dark hair brushing against his cheek, their quiet murmurs the only sound in the vast, silent land. In return, she gave him her own legacy. She taught him the words to her mother's songs. She told him the stories that went with them, tales of the first woman, of the mischievous coyote, of how the stars came to be. It was the most sacred part of herself, the heritage her father had tried to beat out of her, the blood the world had called a stain. To share it with him was an act of ultimate trust, a grafting of her roots onto his, and he, in turn, listened with a deep, quiet reverence, committing the strange, beautiful words to memory. He was a man who had been adrift, cut off from his own past by grief, and she was giving him a new history, a new sense of belonging to the earth beneath his feet. One afternoon in the late spring, they stood on the small porch of their cabin, watching the sunset, painting the mesas in hues of orange and purple. The air was soft and warm. A sense of profound peace settled over the valley. "We should be married," Cole said, the words simple and direct. Ilara looked at him, a slow, beautiful smile spreading across her face. "Yes," she said, "we should." There was no preacher to sanctify their union, no law to make it official. Their bond had been forged in circumstances far beyond the reach of any church or state. So they married themselves. They walked hand in hand to the top of a small hill that overlooked their valley, the very spot where they had first decided to build their home. The sky above was a vast, cathedral dome of deepening blue. The wind whispered through the sparse grass, their only witness. They did not exchange rings. They had nothing to give but themselves. They stood facing each other, his large, calloused hands holding her smaller, stronger ones. "I was a man with nothing but ghosts," Cole said, his voice thick with emotion. "You taught me how to live again. My heart, my life, my home, it is all yours, Ilara, forever." "I was a girl who did not believe in kindness," she said, tears glistening in her eyes. "You showed me what it was. You are my safety and my strength and my love. I am yours." They sealed their vows not with a pronouncement, but with a long, gentle kiss that held all the hardship they had endured and all the hope they now shared. They were husband and wife. The wind and the sky and the silent, ancient earth all knew it to be true. As they stood there, a flicker of movement on the distant horizon caught Cole's eye. It was a wagon, a single, solitary prairie schooner, moving slowly westward. It was too far away to see the faces of the people, but he knew who they were. They were strangers, a family chasing the same dream of freedom and a new life that had driven millions across this continent. They were a reminder that the world had not changed. It was still a vast, hard place, full of dreamers and schemers, of cruelty and of hope. But he and Ilara had changed. They had been forged into something new by the fires of their past. Their love was not a grand, sweeping thing that would alter the course of history. It was a small defiance. It was a quiet, stubborn insistence that even in the cruelest, most unforgiving soil, mercy and desire and goodness could take root and grow. They were living proof. The final scene of their story unfolds a year later. It is a warm, late summer afternoon. Ilara is kneeling in the garden they have painstakingly cultivated. The soil is still poor, but with water from the well and endless work, it has yielded a modest crop of corn, squash, and beans. She is stronger now, her body filled out, her movements sure and graceful. She is planting seeds for the fall harvest, pressing them one by one into the dry earth with her thumb. It is an act of unwavering faith in the future. Cole stands on the porch of their cabin, leaning against a post he set with his own hands. He is watching her. The lines of weariness on his face have softened, replaced by a deep and abiding peace. He is no longer the haunted man who rode into Redemption Flats. He is a husband. He is a man who has built a home. He says her name, and she looks up, shielding her eyes from the sun with a dirt-smeared hand. "You're home now," he says softly. A radiant smile illuminates her face, a smile that holds all the love and security in the world. "So are you," she replies. And the camera of the mind pulls back, leaving the two of them there, Two small, determined figures in a vast, sunlit plain. A man on a porch. A woman planting seeds in the earth. Two souls who had found their home not in a place, but in each other. In a love that had bloomed where once there was only dust and hunger. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to our Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.